first, I would like to thank Anhad for organizing an event like this at a time when the idea of India is under very serious threat. वाजपेयी जी के बाद मैं हिंदी में बोलने की हिम्मत ही नहीं कर सकता, इसीलिए अंग्रेजी में बोलूँगा. As a student of history, what I will do is briefly outline the historical context in which the idea of India emerges, which, as I said, is so deeply threatened today. The phrase idea of India is in fact was first perhaps used by Rabindranath Tagore. Jawaharlal Nehru uses it often. But quite often, we do not, many people have different notions of what is the idea of India. What I'd like to do is to, in very brief, outline what are the leaders of our liberation struggle, what our freedom fighters over nearly 100 years created as the idea of India, which is the distillate of which is enshrined in our constitution, as Vajpayee ji said. The constitution actually reflects the whole struggle for the creation of the free Indian nation. Very briefly, the idea of India gets created roughly, the modern notion of the Indian nation gets created in the 19th century, from about the middle of the 19th century. In the same context in which other nations in the world are being formed, from about the 17th to the 19th century is when nation states emerge all over the world, beginning with Europe. This is an important context which I will return to in a moment. But how did our nationalists imagine India? What was their imagination, which is what we are calling the idea of India? Basically, there are 5 basic concepts that constitute the idea of India. The first, obviously, is sovereignty, that is understood to mean anti-imperialism, anti-domination, freedom from domination, even after India becomes free, but certainly when it was not free. And secondly, and this is very important, from the very beginning, democracy was a critical idea of India that the Indian nationalists had. Do remember that as early as the 1890s, Tilak is talking of adult franchise. The rest of Europe is still to have, another half a century at least before the women have a right to vote. And the country where everybody wants to run to, the United States, had to, in the 1960s, still debate whether the blacks will have civil rights. So it was quite revolutionary in the 19th century itself, to imagine India as a democracy. But the important thing is that the nationalists defined what they meant by democracy. And I'll just outline 2 or 3 very critical elements. For them, civil liberties and freedom of speech. The reason why you will obviously see the reasons why I am highlighting certain aspects, because these are the ones which are under threat. Civil liberties and freedom of speech was supposed to be the central idea of democracy. As Gandhiji put it, I'll repeatedly quote Gandhi, as Vajpayee ji correctly said, if anybody in one person represented what the idea of India was, it would be undoubtedly Gandhiji. As he put it, he said, freedom of speech and civil liberties is the water of life. And he says, have you ever heard of anybody diluting water? So what he means to say is that this is a non-negotiable. You cannot dilute civil liberties and freedom of speech, and you can see what is happening to it. The second thing Gandhiji says is freedom of association. Even when people get together to argue for or to move towards revolutionary ideas. This is Gandhiji. And you know how difficult it is now for the members of parliament even to organize a demonstration. Section 144 comes in the way. And thirdly, respect for the opposition. That there is no democracy unless you respect opposition. There is no democracy unless you have divergence of views. And the Indian national movement, if you look at its history, is full of divergent views. among the tallest of leaders, which is what the current regime tries to misuse, trying to portray Gandhi against Nehru, Patel against Nehru, Gandhi and Nehru, Bose against Nehru, and Bhagat Singh versus Gandhi, etc., as if the national movement was essentially fighting amongst each other. But the point is that it is all true, that they did differ with each other, and it was very much accepted that they should. None of them thought that they must have identical views. And I will come to this difference in a moment. The third element of the idea of India was secularism and inclusiveness. This is a very basic aspect of the idea of India, which draws from the notion of democracy. You cannot have a democratic system where democracy is only for some people, depending on their religion or caste or gender or whatever. Either it has to be inclusive for everybody, each language, each difference, or it is not a democracy. Fourthly, in fact, if you look at the literature during the national movement days, these two phrases were used together: secular democracy. You couldn't talk about secularism without democracy, and you couldn't talk about democracy without secularism. The fourth idea was a pro-poor orientation. From the early nationalists onwards, Dadabhai Naoroji's first book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. If you look at the early nationalists from R.C. Dutt to Dadabhai Naoroji to Rana Day to whoever you pick, they make poverty the central issue, why colonial rule must be overthrown. And of course, then with Gandhi focusing on the Daridra Narayan and the socialists and the communists, this idea got more and more expanded. And lastly, the future India was to be based on modern scientific principles, what Nehru called the scientific temper. It was not to be based on an obscurantist, superstition-based system. I would like to make just three broad comments about this idea of India, and then I am done. First, that it was a unique imagination in the 19th century, and we should be proud of that. If there is anything to be proud of, it's not that Arjun had a nuclear-tipped arrow, as the governor of Bengal told us, but it is that in a situation where every other nation state that emerged in the world with a completely different notion. The nation states as they emerged in Europe as the empires broke up were one religion, one language nation states. Catholic France, not even Christian France, Catholic France, Protestant Britain. France was a multilingual country. The French Revolution flattened it out. Only one language, one religion. Unification of Italy, unification of Germany, all on the basis of language, one religion, etc. That is one reason why the British said that India could never be a nation. As our national movement was in its infancy, they said, how can you be a nation? Such a diverse nation with so many languages, so many religions, etc. It cannot be a nation. They said, you are a geographical expression. इस लैटिट्यूड और उस लॉन्गिट्यूड के बीच में हो, आप साउथ एशिया हो मतलब. You cannot be a nation. Whereas our nationalists said that our imagination of the nation is the opposite of yours. It will celebrate diversity. And it was practiced almost from the beginning. The greatest Assamese poet, the greatest Tamil thinker or Telugu thinker or a Bengali writer were also the biggest nationalists. There was no contradiction. Region was not a contradiction. Language was not a contradiction. Because it was imagined, nation itself was imagined in this way. The second difference with the European notion was that in Europe, as the nation states emerged, each one of those nations also became imperial powers. Almost simultaneously as they emerged as nation states, they became imperial powers, which means there was an aggrandizing, hegemonic, dominating element in their understanding of nationalism. Whereas anti-imperialist nationalism, as India imagined, was humane and liberating. Many scholars in the world even now sort of look down upon nationalism because in their mind it is the European version of nationalism they're thinking about. But But that is not the nationalism that our nationalists imagined. I'll come back to this comparison in a moment. The second point that I wanted to make, the broad point, is that in this vision of India's idea of India, there was a consensus in the entire spectrum of our national movement. That is, all different strands of our national movement agreed on all of these ideas. Whether it was Dadabhai Naoroji, or Tilak, or Gandhi, or Patel, or Bhulabhai Desai, or Bhagat Singh, or Bose, whoever, they were all agreed on these. The only people who did not agree with this idea of India were the loyalists and the communalists. This is important, that they did not historically participate or believe in this idea of India. And the third point I want to make is, it is now the communalists who were neither part of the national movement nor had any allegiance to the idea of India. It is they who are hegemonic, it is they who are in power today, and they who threaten this idea of India, and it is they who masquerade as nationalists, who had the true nationalists, whereas it is they who are borrowing a foreign idea, a European idea, which, wherever it was not struggled against, ended up with Hitler and Mussolini. One language, one race, Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. Many of them, as you know, were in writing appreciative of Hitler and Mussolini, and some of them, like Munje, actually went and sought audience with Mussolini and imitated him as much as possible. Okay, so what are we left with at this moment? First, secularism is, as everybody knows, in tremendous threat. This notion of diversity, of living together, which, mind you, the Indian nationalists, I must refer to what Bajpayee said just now, also, that it did not emerge from the air. They didn't just imagine it out of the air. They drew from India's civilizational history. And if you read Discovery of India, for example, Nehru is deeply aware of this. He starts, like Bajpayee, with the Rig Veda in his Discovery of India. And he says, look at the openness. Look at Buddha, where he talks of 1,000 truths. Whereas the possibility of living with difference of an enormous variety, he says, is our cultural heritage. So it is that they drew upon. What we are witnessing is, therefore, not only the destruction of what our freedom fighters had imagined, but the destruction of the civilizational values of this region over a very long period of time that we are witnessing. What we are witnessing, the textbook issue was mentioned. I mean, it's absolutely horrifying. What we are witnessing is the demonizing of a community. The statements, the kind of statements that the BJP leaders have made after this, some texts were removed, for example, on Mughal history. This is your famous or infamous Kapil Mishra. He says, thieves, pickpockets, two-penny road raiders, do paise ke sadak chhap log, they are being called emperors. Then he names them. I mean, he shows off his knowledge of history. He knew at least 3 or 4 Mughal emperors. He mentioned Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, etc. And then he says, all of them belong to the dustbin, not in history. Now, when the NCRT director says we are doing it to reduce the COVID load, etc., that is not the point. What is the ecosystem? It is creating as I said, demonizing the minority community, B, erasure of the minority from your history textbooks, from the names of roads, from the names of railway stations, from the names of cities, and C, pushing the minorities into ghettos by terrorizing them so that ordinary people in their day-to-day lives do not interact with them. Now, this genocide studies globally has shown that genocide is generally preceded by exactly these: erasure, wiping out, demonization, and forcing into ghettos. And it is not a surprise that you already have open calls for genocide with impunity happening in our country. So the danger is real. We are not shadowboxing. Democracy, of course, is under severe attack. I'm not going to talk about it. Freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of association, each one of them is under attack. Questioning of the leader or of the government is equated to questioning the nation itself. So if you do not agree with the government, you are anti-national. Now this is straight out of the textbook of Mussolini. This equating of the government and the leader with the nation is what is happening on a large scale. As for the pro-poor aspect, the less said, the better. The obscene levels of inequality that has been permitted. There are economists here who will talk about it, I'm sure. The complete abandoning of the poor, whether it is the migrant workers or the COVID victims, has made the world has been shocked at how we have completely abandoned the poor. And last, the scientific temper, the less said, the better. The tallest of our leaders talk of plastic surgery doing Ganesha's elephant trunk, and I mentioned the governor of Bengal saying Arjun having a nuclear-tipped arrow and whatever. I mean, we have become a laughing stock as far as the scientific temper is concerned, and education, as you know, is one area where the government has reduced its budget hugely. Surely we don't want a thinking people, we don't want a people asking questions, we don't want universities to function. We are following in a textbook manner what fascist regimes have done elsewhere. Just as Hitler, the first thing he did was to attack Frankfurt University, because that was at that time considered the center of free thinking. What Erdogan has done is attacked in a very big way the most important institution in Turkey, in Ankara University, the Mufti, the political science department, which produced almost every major thinker and writer and administrator in Turkey, has been under severe attack, and they have done exactly the same with JNU and with other major universities like Jamia and others in India. The country, I believe, is heading towards, it sounds like an exaggeration, but I do not think so. It's heading towards a civil war-like situation. The notion that you can push a 200 million, minimum 200 million sized minority into the corner, that you can sit in them, that you can ask them to migrate or you can annihilate them, is a notion, if it is spread. I'm only talking of just the minorities. The same notion also exists about the Dalits. Any reference from the textbook about Dalit oppression have been removed, for example. If this continues, we are heading for very dangerous times. Therefore, Anhad's holding this conference for defending the idea of India becomes so important, even in this atmosphere of fear where people are afraid to speak up. I may slightly disagree with Bajpayee here. The middle class, the much reviled middle class, will have to speak up. Almost all revolutionary changes have emerged from the middle class. At least the initiation has come from there. So there is no running away for the intelligentsia, passing the buck onto the poor and the oppressed. The intelligentsia, the educated, the middle class will have to lead the resistance for defending the idea of India, as they did during the national movement.